This military megaproject took 10 years to build and fell in just over a month. It was the total effort of over tens of thousands of troops, 150,000 tons of steel, and half the concrete used to build the Hoover Dam. On the surface, it was the deadliest army France could assemble, a 700-kilometer line of towering concrete forts from the low-level plains near the English Channel to the treacherous cliffs of the Alps. Living in the shadow of another war, this project was France's line in the sand, a series of structures built to defend the nation against the dictators next door. So how did this megaproject fail so badly? Hey, I'm your host Regis, and today we're discussing the megaproject that could have ended World War II before it started, if the Germans didn't know how to use a map. Welcome to the Maginot Line. First, we got to explain some background. Why did France go all in on this doomed project? Well, for that, you have to understand the utter devastation of World War I. More than 8 million French troops enlisted, and when the fighting ended, over 6 million casualties were reported, either dead, wounded, or taken prisoner. The invading German army smashed through Belgium and Luxembourg, turned left, and then took France by surprise. Now, much of that fighting took place on the Western Front, in a broken series of trenches dug by soldiers fighting for their lives. You were just as likely to catch a disease as a bullet in these death traps. And if war broke out again, France couldn't afford to lose more troops like this. Like, they literally didn't have the people to lose. Going into World War I, France had declining birth rates and an aging population. And after World War I, a significant number of their men were dead. And even though they'd pushed back Germany, it was no surprise that another conflict was already on the horizon. After World War I, France was facing growing tension from its neighbors, especially Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I, handed some key territories back to France and held Germany financially responsible for the damage. But it was just a piece of paper, and people needed more than a pinky promise and a wet signature that an invasion wasn't going to happen again. France was in a difficult position here. It couldn't be hostile or even perceived as hostile without provoking another war. It didn't have the numbers to match Germany in a ground war, and to top it all off, the country was flat broke. They needed a defense that would be under budget, incredibly fast to organize, and take advantage of the few people available. Enter the Maginot Line. So, what was it exactly? Well, in the 1920s, military advisors had pieced together a defensive strategy that would take advantage of the natural boundaries around France and create a string of fortified zones along the borders. But when the Minister of War, André Maginot, stepped in, this project went from a scribble on a cocktail napkin to one of the most ambitious megaprojects ever built. Building on the previous plans, he proposed an even more complex line, a broken system of forts, tunnels, and turrets stretching from the Belgian border down across the shared boundary with Germany. Troops positioned along strategic points could easily compensate for their lack of numbers against a larger enemy. Although building from coast to coast carried a heavy price tag, Maginot had a simple response. A concrete wall is less expensive than the lives of our nation's soldiers. 6 years after pitching the plan, he'd secured all the funding needed to create his masterpiece in August 1928. While he died years before it was complete, the project eventually bore his name and became known as the Maginot Line. So, how much of this line did they actually build? Well, as much as they could afford. The Maginot Line cascaded across 720 kilometers, from flatlands near the English Channel to the dense forests bordering Belgium and onto the Vosges Mountains. France had 5 key points that absolutely needed defending: the Italian front, the land from the Mediterranean to the Swiss border, the entirety of the Swiss border, parts of the Rhine, and the border along Belgium's southern front as it extended to the English Channel. With an area so vast and a paper-thin budget, not every point could be locked down tight. But was that a strategic decision or a huge mistake? Well, look at the most significant gap in the Maginot Line, located along the dense Ardennes forest bordering Belgium. The unforgiving terrain was steep and the forest was almost impassable. The French calculated that if the German army invaded through Belgium first to avoid the Maginot Line, they would have 8 to 10 days to prepare after the fighting began. France aimed to use its limited resources to funnel enemy troops into wild, natural boundaries that it could control, but the plan all hinged on its friendship with Belgium. Those decisions would have consequences later. After all, they had a lot of ground to break and very little time to actually break it in. So, what was the most challenging part of this build? Well, the Italian Alps proved more than difficult, and this guy had French politicians a little worried that they needed to step up the timeline. The mountains provided perfect cover for the giant concrete structures, but workers had to dig into the limestone and granite by hand, using crowbars, jackhammers, and pneumatic drills. After a few incidents with liquid explosives, they switched to using smaller cartridges to blast the rock face. And for those hard-to-move boulders, good old-fashioned dynamite. Motorized cable cars transported the rubble down the dangerously steep slopes, along with troops and equipment. The cars moved along a narrow rail track that was pre-made, easy to lay, and fast to disassemble. With this system, crews hauled away more than 1 million cubic meters of material, piece by piece, in Alsace alone. Since so much of the Maginot Line required transport to rural areas, mechanical shovels were used to lay down the network of railways needed to transport materials. But many parts of the mountains were better left untouched. Areas with higher altitudes had temperatures so freezing cold that workers only had a 3-month period every year to build. The harsh conditions forced them to abandon some structures before they were ever completed. Documents also show that the French workers weren't skilled at manual labor, which considerably slowed down construction. But what they built underground was truly remarkable. By 1935, crews had already excavated 100 kilometers of roads and railway systems. When they were finished, they created an underground network stretching over 450 kilometers, made to move troops, guns, and equipment at a moment's notice to other forts linked further down the line. Some of those forts were bored 80 meters underground. They called it defense in depth. Massive forts sprawled like upside-down trees beneath the surface. Underground facilities would house about 1,000 troops or so, with bunkers spiraling upwards towards more and more deadly artillery popping out of the side. Steel turrets and cloches, some weighing over 250 tons, were hoisted to the top of the line with heavy-duty cranes. These giant steel structures popped out at the top like giant mushroom caps, supported by concrete walls over 1 to 2 meters thick. Digging into the mountains gave the forts a natural camouflage, and the rocks were a great bullet repellent. But more than anything, it was a cheap way to build. But not every area could afford to dig that deep. At one point, the sandstone in the Vosges slowed down excavation to 2 meters a day. In Saarland, the clay soil made digging deep without risking flooding impossible. And because the flatlands near Luxembourg had such poor soil conditions, engineers used cut and cover techniques to build the tunnels, meaning they first dug up the trenches, placed the tunnels, and then reburied them. And if they didn't pour the concrete correctly, it could crack and leak later, or worse, break under a bomb. Every part of the line had its problems, but France had one tool at their disposal to bring it all together: reinforced concrete. It's more impressive than it sounds, trust me. You see, reinforced concrete had only been invented by the mid-19th century. With the Maginot Line, it was the first time this method was ever used at such a scale. So, what actually is reinforced concrete? Well, it's made by pouring the mixture over a network of metal rods, creating a more durable material that can cover long spans. In this case, several kilometers at a time. Workers mixed cement on site with horizontal mixers, and many had to compact the layers by hand with cast iron tampers, weighing around 15 kilograms. Other workers were lucky enough to compact the concrete with compressed air and table vibrators. The concrete was poured over the wooden frameworks, with crews often using entire trees to create the walls. Inside the form were steel bars bent into hooks, made to better anchor into the concrete during the pouring process. Workers bent the steel bars one by one manually, using a lever system and fixed hooks on the floor. Concrete was mixed, poured, and compacted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to keep the walls sturdy and waterproof. Crews worked on tight, rotating schedules to prevent fatigue and lived on site to keep the work moving steadily. These conditions were absolutely brutal. But using these methods, job sites like Alsace were able to crank out batches of concrete at the rate of 62 cubic meters per hour. The line's integrity depended almost entirely on this thankless, back-breaking labor. And when construction finally ended, those workers poured over 1.5 million cubic meters of concrete and reinforced the line with over 150,000 tons of steel. France built over 5,000 structures for the Maginot Line, and if they had the cash, they probably would have built a few more. Pillboxes dotted the landscape from Longuyon to the Rhine, spaced at kilometer intervals, leading like a breadcrumb trail to one of those 50 deadly underground forts. Gaps between the lines were filled with minefields, and massive iron girders jammed into the ground made it impossible for a tank to roll through. Almost 100 people worked at a time on 8-hour shifts to cover fields with anti-tank stakes. These large explosive devices were attached to metal poles that weighed almost 25 kilograms and had to be installed by hand, along with kilometers of barbed wire that stretched across dozens of fields and farms. In 1931, 20,000 workers were recorded working on this megaproject, every single one of them putting their bodies on the line before a single shot was fired. That number ballooned over time, and tens of thousands of soldiers rushed in to finish the job in the final year as Germany ramped up their own war machines. Okay, but how much did they actually end up paying? Well, Maginot's steel and concrete killing machine cost over 5 billion francs at the time, which today would be almost $4 billion. And remember, this was the cheap solution. In 1938, after almost a decade of sacrifice, construction failures, and rising debt, work on the Maginot Line finally ended. So, was the price tag worth it? Did the Maginot Line hold? Well, not really, no. But it actually had nothing to do with concrete. If you remember, the Belgian forest was considered dangerous enough as a natural barrier against an invading army. That bit of faulty reasoning gave the top brass a reason to save a few francs and spend less on securing some areas. And on May 10, 1940, this decision proved a massive mistake. 136 German divisions smashed through the Ardennes, avoiding a head-on fight with the Maginot Line and taking on smaller fortifications relatively easily. 2,500 German planes blacked out the skies and decimated the French Air Force before a single pilot boarded a plane. In the coming weeks, the Germans picked apart the line fort by fort. On July 1, 1940, the last soldiers on the Maginot Line surrendered to German forces, just over a month after the invasion began. France had fallen to the German invaders. So what's left of the line today? While the Maginot Line didn't stop World War II, as a wine cellar, it's not half bad. The mighty Schonenburg Fort, the last ouvrage to surrender, is now a museum. You can also visit the forts in Alsace and the Fermont, and Fourachaux forts in Lombache. If a town along the line had an ouvrage, you can probably still check it out. These sections may be testaments to one of the biggest tactical blunders of all time, but they also represent the fierce will of the French people. Even if the full might of the German army swung into the Maginot Line headfirst instead of going around it, there's no doubt their blitzkrieg tactics would have still overran sections completely. But what do you think? How could the Germans in World War II have been stopped? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to MegaBuilds to watch the next episode of Craziest Mega Projects of World War II. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.